So my name is Brendan. I'm one of the programmers here at Renew Theaters. I want to welcome back everyone from the first event, along with any of our new attendees who signed up for tonight's discussion. Tonight's Film 101 program is sponsored by the Vesta Fund. The Vesta Fund allows us to make this free for our members. I also like to welcome our members and guests from each of our four theaters, the Ambler Theater, County Theater, Princeton Garden Theater, and Highway Theater. Just a reminder of our Zoom and question protocols. I request that everyone remain on mute unless speaking. We'll start with just open questions, which you can unmute and ask away. But if we end up talking over each other, we will move to either raising hands, and I will call on participants and moderate, or we will use the chat feature. So, yeah, just everybody, just be respectful of each other, and but we'll be good to go. As before, we are led through this conversation by Brian Herrera. Brian is an associate professor of theater in the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton University, where he is also a core faculty member in the program in Gender and Sexuality Studies, and a faculty affiliate with the programs in American Studies, Music Theater, and Latino Studies. He is also the author of Latin Numbers, which examines the way in which Latino actors of the 20th century, on the 20th century stage and screen, communicated and influenced American ideas about race and ethnicity. Before I turn it over to Brian, I just wanted to note the article from the art section in this week's New York Times, America and Latinos on Screen and Up Close, which lists 20 essential films since 2000, and encourage everyone to check out the article and add to their watch list. It's a really great article, and a link to that article, I was told, was shared via our Film 101 email this morning. So be sure to check that out after our discussion tonight. So now, without further ado, I will now turn over the discussion to Professor Herrera.
Hello, everybody, and it's so great to see so many faces that I recognize from last time, recognize from elsewhere, and I'm thrilled to host this conversation. Just by way of reminder and introduction, the Film 101 series this cycle there's a series of 4 conversations that I am hosting and guiding over the next. One was about 3 weeks ago. We looked at the film The Gang's All Here, one of the sort of the most legendary of the Carmen Miranda vehicles, as we talked about the first sort of wave of Latino, or what we might call Latin legibility, of the sort of the phenomenon of being able to see in spectacular musical ways the ways that Latino stories, narratives, sites, and geographies were imagined in the American mainstream cinema. And indeed, over the next month or so, as we come back together, not every week, but every 3 weeks, to look at a successive film in this history of the ways in which musical narratives, or narratives featuring musical performances, sometimes stories about musicians, sort of the way this interesting genealogy of the centrality of the musical narrative in this mainstream depiction of Latino characters, actors, scenarios, and scene and geographies. And so, as often happens with, if you know me at all, you know one of the lines I often share is, as a scholar, as a historian of US popular performance who focuses on how mainstream film, television, and theater sort of create a way to sort of see changes over time with regard to ideas about race, ethnicity, and gender and sexuality. One thing, I'm a specialist in US Latino performance and the presence and absence of Latino characters and actors. But often what I say is, for me, all roads end up routing back to West Side Story. West Side Story is both the source of a lot of my points of question, and they also, as I often find, many conversations reroute and return to West Side Story. Because West Side Story, a stage musical that became a film musical of the mid-century, is in some ways a tentpole of understanding a lot of what is sort of the common, West Side Story haunts a lot of subsequent performances. It's engaged, it's constantly revived, it's constantly revisited. It is a classic of American stage and cinema that is loved as much as it is loathed. It is critiqued. A part of its history has been full of critique, even by some of the people who made it. And so what I'm always interested in is the fact of its constant return, the fact that it keeps being revived. Indeed, some of you may, as film aficionados, some of you may be aware that we were looking forward to a new screen adaptation of West Side Story that was to have premiered in just 2 months. It, of course, like so many things in 2020, has been pushed off, and that announcement came only a few weeks ago. But so West Side Story also had a major stage revival in New York City this year that was, again, like anytime West Side Story shows up in a mainstream way, it excites a lot of interest, a lot of critique, and a lot of reckoning with why is it so beloved and so frustrating simultaneously. And one of the things about the movie that I think is really important for us to understand is, unlike most stage musicals that are adapted to cinema, the film stands co-equal with the stage production. Often we'll see things like where the movie makes the musical better. You know, some might say that controversially about Sound of Music, like the movie sort of makes the impact of that film, of that story, work differently than it does on stage in a way that is enhanced. Other times we'll look at a film like South Pacific and realize the stage version is like much more impactful. So there's these ways in which often when we think of canonical musicals of the stage that have been made into major motion pictures, well, there's often a way in which we'll pick the better one. The common sense logic is that, oh, like, I'm not going to even introduce Chorus Line or Nine, but these examples of like musicals that people love on the stage and loathe on the screen. And really there's only, or vice versa. And I do think West Side Story, alongside very few other films, sort of stands as a co-equal, like, the film remains a cinematic classic, often considered in the top whatever list is being made. It was often considered, especially in the 20th century, one of the top 10 or top 20 of most important films. And then also the stage musical is always being referenced as a crucial text, one of the foundational pieces of the history of the American musical. And the thing that, as my own research, I've written more about West Side Story than I've written about anything else. One of the things I constantly return to is the dynamic tension between the stage and the screen iteration. And so part of what I'm interested, but the things that people love about this movie musical are often the same things they love about the stage musical. The extraordinary choreography, the extraordinary music, the visual sweep, and the excitement of the storytelling configurations. And so part of what I'd be interested in talking tonight about is, once again, remember that the format of this conversation is a conversation. I am here to introduce the premise. You've all watched the film, hopefully recently, but possibly dozens, possibly hundreds of times. It's hard to know. I couldn't count my own numbers of times I've seen the film. But what I would be interested in doing is fielding your queries about things that you were wondering about, things you've always wanted to ask about, things that about the film that you're interested to know if there's any additional story. I can't promise that I'll have an answer to all of your questions, but I can promise that I will be able to sort of think through your question with you, even if I don't have particular information to solve the conundrum you might arrive with. By way of reminder and by way of confirmation, is I frame my conversations as I will take a question and I'll riff for a while. And then I'll take another question, I'll riff for a while. At some point I'll switch and I'll take 3 questions in quick succession. And part of the adventure is to see how I loop them together, even if they're completely unrelated. And so part of that sort of the way we'll run, and I'll do my best to call on you. A reminder is if you would like me to call on you, make sure that your camera is activated, but until I call on you, please make sure that your microphone is muted. And if everybody could check right now on their configuration to make sure that they understand that they're muted and understand whether or not their camera is on. And also, I'll do my best to call on you by name, but I'm also going to be relying upon the name that you have on your screen, which may or may not have anything to do with you. So just be alert to that as well. I did see one hand being raised, and so I'm going to start with Catherine. I think that was your hand raised.
Thank you. I'm very eager to get started. Can you hear me? My connection isn't as strong.
Yes, I can hear you lovely.
You can hear me. Thank you. So a quick story about this musical being so recognizable is just when we did it in high school, I was anybody's, and it was the only show I've ever been in where the choreographer was just so insistent that everything be the exact replica, right? Every step, every turn. And it was so surprising even then that nothing else would really do because it was so well known and so respected. But I think that just goes to show, the lasting impact. Is every production I've seen live has been the same choreography. I can still remember parts of it. But my question is about what you just mentioned. Why do you think it translates so well to film? What about it made it so good in other musicals?
Yeah, so we lost the last bit of that, Catherine. Your microphone muted, but I think I got the gist of your question, which is why does it translate so powerfully to film? And in a way that often musicals don't. And I think a big part of that is the history of the film's production is a really fraught one. In that it's officially credited as being co-directed by Jerome Robbins and Robert Wise. And the story behind that is Robbins, as you may or may not know, was quite a contentious figure on the American landscape. Some might use the colloquial term control freak. Other people might use the colloquial term diva. Other folks might use the colloquial term unrepentant asshole. It was a variety of ways that Robbins was a very powerful figure who had a lot of very strong ideas about the work he did. And indeed, West Side Story was his brainchild. It was a brainchild that was transformed in collaboration with Leonard Bernstein and Arthur Lawrence and later Stephen Sondheim. But it was really a project that he had as a glimmer of an idea, and a big part of his vision all the way along was to introduce a muscular mode of stage choreography for the male dancer, right? To really reimagine what stage choreography, what a male dancing body on a stage looked like. And so when the musical came along, he had complete ownership of the property. When the movie came along, he was the one, like, there's no way they were going to make a movie unless Jerome Robbins said so. And he said, I'm directing it. And so what he did was he started directing it, and he did what he often did, is he did it his way. And one of the things is very quickly it was clear on MGM's side that they were going to fire him, and they were going to fire him as soon as they possibly could. But Robert Wise, who is pretty brilliant in a lot of ways, understood we can't fire him until he does the stuff that only he can do. And the stuff that only he can do was the choreography of the major dance numbers, especially the dance numbers featuring the Jets. And so that's where we get numbers like Prologue, numbers like Cool, some of the most iconic dances of American cinema were ones that that Robbins actually did control how those were filmed. And one of the key cinematic production techniques that he did, which I'm still stunned that we don't see enough of, which is he created stages where the cameras could, the film, as you may know, was in a neighborhood that was in the process of being razed to make way for what is now Lincoln Center. So they basically had a number of square blocks of urban landscape, tenement dwellings that were about to be torn down, and streets that were blocked off for all that construction. So he actually had access, and he could. What he had them do is he had them dig tunnels in the road so that the camera could sit at foot level. And so these giant camera rigs could be at the level of the floor of the stage, which is why we get those extraordinary numbers, extraordinary moments in Prologue where we see, for example, that iconic shot of the three Jet dancers where we're basically at toe level and we see their legs go out in a sort of an arabesque kind of style, or when we're in Cool, when we're in the garage where we're below. So I think part of what it was Jerome Robbins came in as a novice filmmaker, but as a really sophisticated visual engineer for what dance needed to look like. And so the visual engineering that he was able to do in creating the foundational vocabulary of the film, Robert Wise was then able to elaborate and fill in the blanks, doing story stuff. So like the kaleidoscope thing with the lights and stuff like that at the Dance in the Gym, that's not Robbins. What's Robbins is when we're underneath their feet. And also, to my knowledge, to the best of my knowledge, because it's all a little sketchy, to the best of my knowledge, Robbins was there. He set up the ensemble. He sort of cast the actors. He set up a lot of the world of the show, and then filmed some key numbers. And then they fired him and refused to allow him on set. And so what they had was his team, like Peter Gennaro and others who were there, and they ended up shaping Numbers Like America. And Peter Gennaro mostly choreographed America on stage anyway. So there was ways in which the team, and a lot of those dancers were Robin's dancers who'd worked with him on stage as well. So there's folks who carried Robin's muscular understandings and the way the look of the story needed to be. The other thing is the key thing about the look of the film transfers in that most, like Irene Shroff did the costumes on both sides, on both stage and screen. There were certain ways where they imported a lot of the visual vocabulary of the stage production. Robbins retained co-directing credit, even though he directed arguably like less than 15% of the film, and he was there to be sure to claim his Oscar. And indeed, he claimed he claimed credit in a way, and part of the reason why what you experienced, Catherine, on stage is the Robbins estate retained, which is not uncommon for choreographers subsequent Robbins. Michael Bennett, who did Chorus Line, some Fosse stuff, does this too. It's not uncommon that they were beginning to make a claim for the authorship of choreography, so there was a way that you couldn't license the production, especially in a major production, unless you also licensed the dances. So your choreographer in high school may have actually been contractually obliged to replicate the dances, though it also meant that there was sort of reaching the mastery in a kind of ballet way of doing the classic choreography of a canonical dance. And it wasn't until we begin to see in the last 20 or so years the relaxation of some of those protocols from the Robbins estate. And that was what was one of the more remarkable pieces about the stage production that was on Broadway, was that it took a radically different approach to what the dance vocabulary of the musical was. It brought in a contemporary superstar in modern dance, and to sort of really reimagine the physical vocabulary. And it did in ways that were both illuminating and thrilling and totally muddled and confused. So it was an interesting attempt of how do you go into the classics. And I do think that's going to be one of the most interesting things to look at in the film version that's coming out from Steven Spielberg next winter, which is the question of what is the way that the choreography is in conversation with Robbins, or decides to turn away from Robbins. Is it holding on to Robbins and building with it, or is it actually turning away from it? In the early costume designs, for example, we see that the costume design for the 2021 film has actually made a bold step away from the visual vocabulary of the early film in a way that a lot of subsequent productions do. Like there's an excellent blog post, if you're interested, by a bloggers called Tom and Lorenzo. And if you did Tom and Lorenzo blog, you'd get it. And they have a series right now where they're doing they're fashion bloggers. And what they do is they've been doing a series of posts about iconic looks, iconic dresses, or iconic costumes. And the one they did just last week was Anita in her lilac dress in America. And when I posted that article on Facebook, a friend of mine, a former student, posted, who is a costume designer as well as a playwright and a director. A former student commented that he once knew a costumer who had a meltdown with an actor who had played Anita in 4 or 5 productions and had never worn anything other than a lilac colored dress, and was freaked out that this costumer was putting in her a different color because it totally messed with her assumption of who the character was. So there's ways in which the sort of the synergy between Robbins' visions on stage, his foundational vocabulary in the building of the film, and also his control over the intellectual visual dancing, the property of West Side Story in the 50 or so years after its original production, that we see that imprint remaining, and it's hard to shake. And I think we're in the last 10 years, we've begun to see productions really try to make new approaches to it, shift it a little bit, play with one thing or another. But that imprint is almost indelible. But it's nothing's permanent, even in cinema. But it'll be interesting to see. So that's a few ways of thinking about that continuity. So I see Veronica has her hand up. I don't know if I can unmute you, Veronica. So
I just did it. I'm a little slow on this. Just a comment. I think the social context within which the film, that point in time when the film came out, still has a lot of ramifications to what's going on today. Film came out, I believe, in 1961. 66. And that was the civil rights movement was really quite violent at the time. There was a lot of gentrification going on in New York. That neighborhood where Lincoln Center was built was called Hell's Kitchen. So if hell is hot, you can imagine what Hell's Kitchen was like. A lot of poor people and working class people were being displaced from the core of New York. There was a lot of white flight.
Yep.
People going to suburbs that people of color didn't have the ability to go to for lots of different reasons. So I haven't seen this film since I was a teenager. So it's been a long, long time. I've listened to the music a lot. But you know, the protagonist in the movie, it's really the police. I mean, they're nasty to the immigrant Puerto Ricans. They're nasty to the working class white kids. And, you know, the contact between the police and both these groups of young people, it's very vicious at times.
Yeah,
at
totally.
times. And I'm not, you know, I'm not just saying with, you know, the experiences we're having with police violence today is like, you know, the universal behavior of the police, but it is striking when you see that. And, you know, the anti-immigrant.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, and that's
the film. There also the scene of sexual violence that happens to Anita when she goes into the candy store. I mean, that's like a step away from being a gang rape.
well, and it's called in the score. It's
Yeah,
in the score, Anita's rape.
You know, so there are a lot of really powerful social themes that are part of this movie that, you know, 60 years together, you know, we talk about how things change but stay the same. They're still relevant today. I think that makes it a very, very powerful film. The dancing is phenomenal. And just on a more personal note, when this movie came out, I grew up in a town not just outside of New York City. I had friends that were Puerto Rican descent, and this was the first movie that they could kind of like latch on to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, given there are issues and problems with it, but it was a movie for them where the Latino was not this side element, this comedic figure, this kind of like pal of the pal, but you know, this whole story is evolving around the experience of these kids. And I love the character Anita. I think of all the characters in the film, she comes across as being the most complete and the one with the most dimension to her, because she goes through all these different, well, she has different relationships with different characters. She goes through this growth, you know, when Bernardo dies. I mean, she can kind of see, she comes out being able to see beyond her dislike and hate. So I find her to be very, very powerful. I found her a little problematic at times because she's not, you know, there's a staccato.
Well, let me interrupt you to sort of do some synthesis, because what you've done, Veronica, there is you have name checked all of the main points of why the movie keeps coming back. Beyond it being a masterpiece of craftsmanship on stage and screen, you've name checked a number of the threads and the themes in it that are the things that hold people's interest and still, and indeed, one of the things that I always say about West Side Story is it was, there was a moment in my early graduate career where I had to sort of think about what could I look at for an extended, like a graduate student, a graduate teacher told me, you need to find a dissertation topic that you can wake up next to for the next 10 years of your life. And so, and I was like working on a project about boxing at the time. And I said, I can't wake up next to boxing. And I said, so what could I think about every day happily for the next 10 years? And I said, West Side Story, precisely because of the litany of things that you've just added. Because I think one of the things about West Side Story is is, I mentioned, I love it as much as I loathe it. There's as much that's inspiring and thrilling about Anita as there are things that are confounding and a little bit perplexing. I do think there's questions of authorship with Anita. Like there's some things that the performance of Anita, whether Rita Moreno or Chita Rivera, sort of exceeds the script because the script makes room for it and then the performer takes room for it. So there's something very powerful there. I also think you made him, I would offer one friendly amendment to what you suggested in that the police are the protagonist. I would disagree. I would say that the police are the primary antagonist, and we misread.
Oh, yes, that's what I meant to say.
Yeah, we misread the film. When we most of the time we think about the film as being the battle between the Jets and the Sharks, and in some ways they are the complement to the Lovers, right? It's this quadrant of the Jets and the Sharks, Tony and Maria, and there's all kinds of things that could happen between those things. But what we do have is a consistency of the uselessness or the obstacle presented by grown-ups. Because what the film and the musical especially is really built on is the premise that if you look at who the grown-ups are, they're oblivious, useless, or a problem. You know, and so there's this way in which that what possibly the one thing that the young people have in common is the fact that the older folks just don't get it. And even the ones who are friendly are not very useful. And that's where I think one of the most important characters when we're thinking about the grown-ups is not always Krupke or Schrank or Doc, but really the character called Gladhand, who is played by John Astin in the film, who is the host of the dance. And the fact that he is just like good intentions, but completely incapable of managing what is in front of him. And that is a perfect comedic foil to what we hear being narrated in G Officer Krupke, where the Jets very deftly narrate all the ways that the adults think they understand, but actually don't. And so so that's, I think, one of the really important pieces. And then finally, I think the other thread that I'd like to tease out of what Veronica shared with us is the really complicated way that this feels, even though it always is so rooted in 1957 New York, and then the film comes just a few years later, but late 1950s New York, and sort of the way of talking about civil rights and a way about talking about interracial conflict without actually having to deal with Black people. You know, so there's a way in which the musical was built and sort of came up with the idea of, I mean, as you well probably know, the musical was originally conceived as Jerome Robbins' first notion of it was what it would be a conflict between Jews and Catholics on Lower East Side during the high holidays, and that it would be, a Catholic Romeo and a Jewish Juliet, or vice versa. I forget exactly the configuration at this moment. And and he had done full extended treatments. He had the whole story worked out. He had the full plan. And then Arthur Lawrence comes along as the book writer and says, well, you know, everything you're saying, you want to do this brand new story that feels up to the minute and contemporary and all of this. What you've just described is the plot of the most cliched romantic comedy of the 1920s, Abe's Irish Rose. And so they had to say, like, how do we make it contemporary? How do we make it contemporary? And they briefly flirted with the idea of having it white and Black romance, but they felt that would be too incendiary. There would be no way that it would play. And as the story comes to us, they were all working in Hollywood at a time, and Arthur Lawrence and Leonard Bernstein encountered each other at a pool at a Hollywood hotel where they were both in town working on movies. And they came up with the idea of the Romeo Project, which is what it was called at the time, and the headlines were gang riots on Olvera Street, which if you come back in 3 weeks when we talk about Zoot Suit, we'll sort of look at that world of Olvera Street, and we'll look at the world of Chicano and Mexican-American youth cultures in Los Angeles in the 40s and 50s. And so they were thinking, well, we can't really, we want to do it in New York, so it doesn't really work for Mexicans. And somebody had the bright idea, it's like, we don't have Mexicans, but we got Puerto Ricans. And it was and it was not necessarily rooted in an expectation of being accurate, rooted in an expectation of being a sort of a documentary or an a culturally correct depiction of either the what Lawrence called the anthology of groups called American, or Puerto Ricans. It wasn't really interested in being accurate. And indeed, when they did the slang, they wanted to make sure they didn't use any actual contemporary slang, that they stylized the slang in a way that sounded almost like slang, but also was a little bit tweaked in a way that sort of abstracted it, and in the way of sort of doing, just like the dances look like mambo, but are also elaborated in other ways, like this way of trying to make it evoke the contemporary while not being documentary. And one of the interesting phenomenons is almost immediately, because of the legibility of the way that it maps onto so many other stories that are hot and continue to be hot in American life, there's so many ways where almost immediately a West Side Story, which was designed very intentionally by all of its collaborators to be a work of ambitious art, almost immediately it was misrecognized as documentary. It was misrecognized as accurate depictions of the of the crisis among youth culture. We see letters in the New York Times where social workers and teachers and others are saying, this is the most up-to-the-minute depiction of the conflicts faced by our youth. We should make sure young people should see this play because it speaks directly to them. It is them. When in fact, none of the collaborators talked to young people. They sort of went and lurked in clubs. They sort of did this stuff, but they were doing it like geniuses of the modern moment. Like they were like sort of inspired by the world, not necessarily trying to be realistic, but there was something about it that it felt real in a particular way. And we could say that the reality is not so much in what it was depicted, but perhaps the emotional integrity. Because one of the things that Robbins brought to the production that is really infused in all of the productions is he brought the sort of the leading style of American acting at the time, which is we often call the American method, is the idea of having emotional authenticity, of having a character's inner life, of having characters having backstories. This idea that these unnamed characters or characters that maybe don't get a lot of attention, that he wanted to build a sense of humanity in all of them, and that drew upon these young dancers who often, in many cases, had never acted before, ask them to sort of really imagine a full characterization, not just an attitude or a posture. And so there was something I think that resonates in Rita Moreno's performance in particular that feels like there's, for all of the things that are artificial and fake about West Side Story, there's moments of clarion humanity and clarion, like there's something that feels like that's so exciting and so real. So even though all this other stuff makes me anxious or annoyed, I love that so much, or there's something so powerful about that. And so the movie, I think for subsequent generations, it constantly confronts folks with this, what is the sort of the practice of like taking what you like from a cultural text that might not always might have other problematic parts, but you love that one song or you love that one character. And it does, in ways that your colleagues in high school might have experienced, it ends up over-determining expectations of what Puerto Ricanness in particular looks like in mainstream cultural representation. So there is a way where it both sort of gives a mirror, but it also creates a trap. It creates a boundary too. And that becomes one of the core tensions within the longer tradition of Latino performance and film, is the way that West Side Story exists and haunts it. Indeed, West Side Story came up in our conversation about a film like a few weeks ago. We were thinking about West Side Story, a film that comes out 20 years prior. We were already thinking about West Side Story because the way that West Side Story informs our vocabulary about how we see certain kinds of stories is very vivid. Elise.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. I have kind of a two-part question. The first, I'm surprised to hear you use words like reviled, loathed, irritated, whatever. I'm curious to know what kind of criticisms were leveled at the film, either back in the day and in the years since. The only one I can really think of is the casting of Natalie Wood as a Hispanic person in a movie that was, for all intents and purposes, trying to be enlightened and liberal, and also the voice. That wasn't her voice, was it?
No, and it wasn't always.
So could you speak on that, please?
Yeah. So the two threads of it is, I think both of them. I think that yes, there's been ever since there's been a West Side Story, there's been Latino critique of West Side Story. And indeed, many of them, there were protests that were threatened before its first preview performance in Washington, D.C. And that was around the line, You Ugly Island, Island of Tropic Diseases, this sort of ways in which the depictions, the narrative depiction of Puerto Ricans was evoking really toxic stereotypes and attitudes about dirty immigrants and disease-carrying immigrants. And so there were certain ways where the critiques were coming because it was sort of and there were articles in the New York Times early on in the film, in the stage production. The film, though, existed in both the stage and the film iteration, existed in a moment of cultural representation where indeed the idea of Rita Moreno or Chita Rivera playing the part was almost an exception to the rule. There was not a lot of interest in making sure that the actors matched the characters. And indeed, the idea of the artifice of theater or the artifice of film would be the tools that would be brought to bear, because it was utterly conventional. It was utterly conventional for actors to be dubbed, even if they could sing. It was utterly conventional for actors to play cross ethnicity. And indeed, Rita Moreno, in her own film career, one of her other notable film performances is Tuptim, the Burmese concubine in King and I, where she plays cross-racially as Asian. So it wasn't uncommon, and it was sort of taken for granted that that was in the repertoire of practice. Within a few years of West Side Story's release, that became increasingly under scrutiny, and it became one of the questions of the three principal Puerto Rican characters, only one, or the four principal Puerto Rican characters, if we count Chino as well, only was when one was played by a Puerto Rican. But the tract of who was playing them, a Russian Jew, a Greek, a Filipino, and a Puerto Rican, that sort of idea of these sort of darker races playing that was very typical in Hollywood. And it was a logic of it that was like playing to type or playing to look like, and we saw an aesthetic shift in the later 1960s and the early 1970s in film, where there became a greater investment in authenticity, with characters wanting to grow their hair out and grow a beard rather than put on a beard or put on a wig. Really an increasing interest in playing and reaching for realism and reaching for a mimetic one-to-one connection, for the actor to disappear into the role as opposed to the actors manifesting the role and holding that star power of Natalie Wood like we're thinking simultaneously of Natalie Wood and Anita and Maria, like that sort of dual thing is utterly conventional in the time, but very quickly it becomes one of the contentious features of the failures of West Side Story. The conspicuous brown makeup, even on Latino actors, the ways in which the accents are nonsense accents, heavily elaborated and scripted accents, but are not Puerto Rican accents. And so this kind of stylization of Latino-ness in the promise of authenticity becomes a tension, especially when it's misrecognized as an accurate representation. So that becomes one of the things that comes up with, because it has such a phenomenal success both on stage and in film, that it becomes the template against which other human beings as well as cultural representations are constantly judged or replicated. You know, we start seeing that West Side Story becomes the referent for authenticity when in fact it's totally artificial, which becomes part of the problem. And indeed, there is a long tradition of critique of West Side Story, mostly on the side, like within what we would call Latino studies or among Latino cultural criticism. And there's two main tracks, tracks on that criticism, which one is talking about the problems of its constructions, its inaccuracy, the kind of stereotypes or misconceptions it perpetuates, etc. And I think in America, in the film version of America, we see one of those key stereotypes, which is the women are advocating for the future, but the Latino man is advocating for the past. And that's one of the most pernicious stereotypes about Latino and masculinity, is that it's retrograde, it doesn't want women, it doesn't allow for future, like, so it activates certain stereotypes that are not necessarily even necessary to this, and that's one of the things that just these things that get cycled and like, oh, that must be the way Latino men just are. The sort of the presumption that certain cultural groups are always culturally conservative, it plays into that stereotype, when actually the diversity of Puerto Rican opinion at this time was as diverse as any other cultural group. So there's this kind of ways in which that there's, so one tradition of parsing out those inaccuracies and misconceptions. There's another tradition, which is basically like, it's bullshit. It has nothing to do with me or Puerto Rico. I'm not going to talk about it. So stop singing, stop calling me Maria. I don't know what a shark is. Leave me alone. There's a kind of engaged critique, and there's a kind of like, shut up, you're with your white nonsense critique. You know, and so there's a kind of, there's two registers, but there is the fact that it has to be dealt with. It has to either be grappled with, or it has to be sort of categorically dismissed as irrelevant to the project. And this we see in the work of poets, of writers, of dramatists, of journalists, of constantly having to deal with the assumption that West Side Story is a referent that's worth using. And so that is and it's only really been in the 21st century where we've begun to see that disappear. But for those 40 years of the last half of the 20th century, West Side Story was such a ubiquitously known text, and one of the only mainstream texts that had Puerto Ricanness named as a feature of it, that it ended up becoming a kind of cultural obstacle as well as and so it's this thing where it does that thing where it did for me. When I taught the film the other day in class, I talked about the story the first time I saw the film, which was I was sitting in my grandmother's trailer in Las Vegas, New Mexico, which is about an hour north of Santa Fe. And I came on the afternoon movie, and I didn't really know what it was, but my grandma's trailer had air conditioning, and she also had cable because it was Las Vegas, so there was no actual TV, so they had to have cable. And so it was like, and I was like, I'm gonna watch this movie. And I watched it, and I didn't know what it was. I'd heard that it was a thing, and I watched it, and I saw the part of Bernardo, and I was like, the role for me, I get to, like, it was like when I saw the movie, I was like, finally my part. Like I was 12 years old. I'd barely been bit by the drama bug, but already I knew. So I saw something of myself in this show, even though I was not Puerto Rican, I was not from New York. I was a Latino from New Mexico. I couldn't dance, but still I saw myself in that show. And so I think there is that paradox. And what we'll see, like people like Lin-Manuel Miranda, Jennifer Lopez, a lot of folks have very passionate relationships that are multifaceted, sort of this duality of like, I love it, but there's problems. And so how do we balance it? And I think what's key though, is you look at a whole other set of critical literatures about West Side Story, and the critiques are not like, that's just not legible because it is happening within a cultural group. So the Latino critiques sometimes penetrate mainstream discourse, but generally don't. Generally, most of the commentary talks about the masterpiece of the musical. And the masterpiece of the musical of using this grand musical to tell contemporary stories that have contemporary relevance. And so indeed, and that's in some ways how the musical was offered, both as the stage and screen version, because many of us who are of my generation or who went to elementary school or went to high school in the 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s, 1970s, 80s, or 90s, may have encountered a paperback text of Romeo and Juliet that on the back half of it had the libretto of West Side Story. Because often West Side Story was used as a teaching tool away into Shakespeare, away from contemporary into the Shakespeare mode. Also, the cast recording the movie soundtrack of West Side Story is in the top, I think it's still in the top 50, but definitely the top 100 of best-selling albums of the 20th century. And it wasn't until Saturday Night Fever came along that it was booted from the best-selling. So if you subdivide it into movie soundtrack, it still is in the top 10. So it was, many of us would have recognized the album because it was just an album that everybody had. The songs like Tonight and Somewhere and There's a Place for Us and these other songs sort of entered into the popular songbook where you would hear Barbra Streisand or Shirley Bassey sing them. So there's a way in which the ubiquity of West Side Story both overwrote the controversy, but then also kept the controversy going. So that's where the critique comes from. So we got about 15 minutes left. So I don't know if there's more questions. If there are, I'd like to take them, if you could offer them briefly, and then I'll try to stitch them together in the final comment. So I see one from Gail, and I don't know if there's, I'll be taking three. So first Gail, anybody else? Zoe, and if there's anybody else, speak now? I think I see Grant in the shadows there. So so we'll go Gail, Zoe, then Grant, and if we could do the question pretty quickly, and don't worry if they don't relate. That's not your problem, that's mine. Okay?
Sure,
So
Brian.
starting with Gail. Hi, Gail.
Hiya. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to Lin-Manuel Miranda's translation of the lyrics.
Great. Zoe?
You've already spoken quite a bit about the casting of the film, but I was interested to see if you had any other, anything else to add about how the performers were chosen for their roles.
Okay, great. Grant? I don't hear you yet. Can you unmute?
Yep. I had tickets for the new revival, and it seems like I've seen it before, but I Feel Pretty is a big moment. And I know it was cut from the revival, so I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay, great. So I think one of the things that, let me see which way I want to go with this. So to start with Gail's question, and then let me see what Terry asked just very quickly. Okay, so Terry is asking a question about gender and fighting, and especially the concluding moment with Maria. So let me just write that down because I'm going to forget it, but I'll try to conclude with that one. So basically, I think one of the things that is, so there's an interesting question about accuracy that haunts West Side Story in its many revivals. And there's different ways in which accuracy sort of plays out. And one of them is often around the question of I Feel Pretty. And the song I Feel Pretty becomes, because famously Stephen Sondheim, who wrote the lyrics for the musical West Side Story, he has famously critiqued his own lyrics for West Side Story as being more sophisticated in their verbal play than a young woman from Puerto Rico who was only learning English would be able to likely do. So he began to realize that it was sort of him indulging himself as a lyricist, not necessarily listening to the character. And so he's spoken about that for years, sort of doing that thing of like somebody being embarrassed about one of their earliest works, sort of pointing to like, sort of, don't hold me responsible. I was young, I didn't know what I was doing. That kind of approach to, so there was very, and that opens up this question of what to do with I Feel Pretty. And if you want to make an interesting study of different iterations of West Side Story, it's very tempting to look at America. It's very tempting to look at Prologue. But I think the most telling example of what is different about each production's approach to it is what they do with I Feel Pretty. Where do they place it in the dramatic sequence? How do they stage it? What changes do they make to it? Because in the Robert Wise production, which is the movie, they rearranged the structure and they disrupted what is the most important feature of the piece of I Feel Pretty in the stage version, in that it is the song that is sung before Maria gets the news. And so the audience knows that her brother is dead and her lover killed him, but Maria does not yet know. So she's unable to imagine a future, and she's really at the happiest thing. And the audience is saying, oh, pobrecito, you don't even know, right? There's this way in which the audience, and so that amplifies the lightness of the song. Robert Wise wanted to build a cinematic trajectory, which was not any returns. Like stage shows often build dramatic action, so they build forward and then they loop back and they build forward again and they loop back and they build forward again. Robert Wise wanted the momentum of West Side Story to be a constant up, which meant he put the comedic numbers, which usually come in Act 2, Giaffa, Krupke, and I Feel Pretty. He put them before the deaths, and then place the deaths later in the sequence. So there was a different rhythm. And so in some ways, both Krupke and I Feel Pretty, which are actually sort of grim and sardonic and sort of like morbid because there's all this death behind them on stage, in the movie, they become light, frivolous, fun, frolicking kind of numbers. And that's exactly why in the most recent stage production of West Side Story, Ivo Van Hove, who adapting the script, took out the intermission, did a lot of things about it, and was really rearranging some song placements to mirror what the film was. Because I actually feel like if the spoiler alert, if the production comes back on Broadway, when and if Broadway ever comes back, one thing to know about the stage production of the Ivo Van Hove West Side Story is that it's basically a staging of the film. It's basically taking a dramatic approach to the material that is borrowed from the film and actually uses a great deal of cinematic detail in order to sort of play with that dramatic structure. And that's sort of the rearrangement of songs, and in some ways the disappearance of I Feel Pretty. But going back, a previous revival in 2009, which connects to Gail's question about what about Lin-Manuel Miranda, as many of you may or may not know, Lin-Manuel Miranda was invited by Stephen Sondheim to participate and collaborate on a revival of West Side Story that was directed by Arthur Lawrence, the person who had written the original libretto. And it was being staged, and part of what was built on was a translation that Arthur Lawrence's partner had made of it, and had translated the whole musical into Spanish. And when Lawrence encountered it on stage in Venezuela, I believe, or Colombia, and he saw that there's something different about the way the sharks move in Spanish. And he began to wonder if there was a way in which that could correct the sort of the resistance to West Side Story that persisted. If in some ways, instead of them, and he was the book writer, so he said, maybe instead of them speaking what I thought was accented English or whatever, maybe if they spoke Spanish when they were talking to themselves, maybe that would amplify a sense of accuracy, and that could get pushed back against one of the key resistances that the project kept getting. And so when they brought this production, when they were developing this production for Broadway, they made the decision that they were going to really approach it more realistically and say, whenever the folks the sharks are talking to themselves, they're probably going to be mostly speaking Spanish, as they would. Why would they be speaking accented English when they're talking to each other? And so that led to Lin-Manuel Miranda being commissioned to be the co-collaborator on revising Spanish lyrics for key songs like A Boy Like That, key songs for, and most notably, I Feel Pretty, and indeed parts of America. So it's an interesting collaboration, because it was perceived at the time when the production came out, it was right after Lin-Manuel Miranda had his first major success with In the Heights. And it was perceived as sometimes as an anointing, as a kind of an anointing. The secret is Lin-Manuel doesn't speak Spanish very good. So it's actually the uncredited lyricist is Luis Miranda, Lin's father, who is a huge musical theater buff, and actually sort of caused the musical theater bug to bite Lin Miranda in the first place. And so, and if you have HBO, there's a documentary about Luis that's coming out next week, I believe, that is Siempre Luis, which tells the story of Lin-Manuel Miranda's father and his political career, and also his he just loved musicals. And so, but it's an interesting collaboration. And one of the things about it, as I've written about it, is the transition is that they start out being like, this is a brand new thing. This is updating West Side Story. This is exactly what we need to sort of bring West Side Story into a new century. And immediately the audiences rebel, because some of their favorite lyrics are lyrics in I Feel Pretty. Some of their favorite lyrics are the lyrics and then some of their favorite jokes are the jokes in America. And so audiences very quickly start pushing back, and there's some interesting critique of what's lost in not translation. They originally started doing super titles, but then they abandoned that. All these kind of things go on to the production. Ultimately, the cast recording was recorded with the Spanish version, so those versions survive, and there are some video captures of those performances that are accessible. But within 6 months of the production's opening on Broadway, after the cast recording was released, et cetera, what we began to see was a slow return of all English lyrics. And indeed, when the production went on the road and tour, it went on tour without the Spanish lyrics. And so, it's an interesting history of this question of how possessive folks are about West Side Story as they know it. Because one of the things about West Side Story is it is beloved not so much for its stars, but for its property. And I think going to Zoe's question about how were the actors cast in the film. And I think very quickly, what I will say is that what I can say is a few things. Is they were mostly, Robbins insisted that he had skilled dancers come in. And indeed, he really fought with the production because he didn't want to hire either Rita Moreno or Russ Tamblyn at first. Russ Tamblyn plays Riff. And but then he got convinced by Rita Moreno, but then the studio was concerned that Rita Moreno couldn't be because her face is not perfectly symmetrical. So they were sort of thinking like she's not like they were imposing all these other things. So but Rita was a moderately known star. And Natalie Wood was a huge star. So in some ways it was a Natalie Wood vehicle. She had less rehearsal time. She had a different kind of trailer situation. One of the great stories of it was when she got on set and realized how hot everything was, and she realized that her trailer was the only one with air conditioning. She said, I refuse to perform unless all of the ensemble has air conditioning in all of their rooms in the rehearsal studios. And so she said, I'm not showing up until they're taken care of. And so there was this kind of way where at first she was like the diva who didn't have to do all of it. And then she came in and threw the diva power around and made everybody's working lives better. So it's an interesting story in terms of that. She also treated it very seriously and expected to have her voice heard in the recording, in the cast recording. I mean, in the actual final print of the film. And it wasn't until she was on set that she was told. She had gone through months of voice training. She had recorded the tracks. And so there was a moment that apparently she talks about as being one of the most difficult for her on set when she realized that she wasn't there. But I do think, just as we're coming on the edge of our time, I want to click through a couple others. Richard Bymer, who played Tony, was expected to be a big star. It was supposed to be the launching vehicle into his mega stardom success, and that just didn't really happen. He had another major role in Diary of Anne Frank, but he never became a superstar. Tucker Smith, who was the only role that was invented of the Jets and the Sharks, was the character of Ice, who was invented. A character of Ice is not a character that's named in any of the stage versions, and it was sort of when they rearranged When Did Riff Die and all this kind of stuff, there were certain song lyrics that had to get reassigned. And Ice, the character played by Tucker Smith, it was also meant to be a launching point for Tucker Smith. He was supposed to be a launching point into stardom. And then Russ Tamblyn also was a known property and a known musical star, a beloved. He was in Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. He played Tiny Tim. He was sort of a teen star that played in this kind of perfect market for West Side Story. Jerome Robbins didn't want him because he wasn't a conventionally trained dancer. He was a more vaudeville trained dancer with an incredible acrobatic and gymnastic capacity, which we see going on. They used it. And so in some ways, the switch when Tucker Smith, who was a trained dancer, was much more useful and cool, but they really needed, because normally Riff does not sing on G Officer Krupke. Normally in G Officer Krupke, Riff is dead. And so to be able to have his showmanship in G Officer Krupke was useful for Robbins conceptually, and also having a real dancer in Cool helped the flip of those two numbers dramaturgically. So there are ways in which the casting was part of the conversation about shaping it. Virtually all of the other actors, the actor played Doc, the actor played John Astin, who played Gladhand, the actors who played Shrank, and I don't know so much about the actor playing Krupke, but those three actors were just day players on every TV show in Hollywood. They show up on Perry Mason, they show up on Rawhide, they show up on Wagon Train. They're just everywhere. So they're just sort of workaday actors. And John Astin then becomes a star with the Addams Family. But it was very much a Hollywood machine production, with the stars being the principals and the other members of the ensemble being workaday day laboring actors, kind of thing. And so what I think is the cast is, but that's one of the tricky things about West Side Story. Typically, the person who becomes a star out of West Side Story is whoever plays Anita. That's the star-making role. Even though even though the actor who played Bernardo got an Oscar too, it was Rita Moreno, who we still talk about today. Even though all of the other actors there were other actors like Mickey Kalin and stuff like this on stage who were important, Larry Kirk, Carol Lawrence, all of these folks had important careers, but it's Chita Rivera who remains a legend. So it's this moment, and then Karen Olivo got the Tony in the previous revival. And the notable thing about the current revival is Anita does not make that same kind of impact. They approached Anita very differently because going back to it's Veronica, right? Going back to Veronica's early point, the current revival really does play up the antagonism with the police. It really does play with this question of youth against the youth, like the rage against the machine, the youth rage against the machine, and the way that when young people are battling with the machine of a society, a police-driven society, the youth end up battling themselves in that same context because it's the deck is stacked against them. But the final thing, and I'll try, I don't know if that sort of gives you some of what I know about the casting, Zoe. I mean, it's not a lot, but it's some fun detail. And it's unclear to me how much Robbins had a voice, Wise had a voice, but the studio had a major voice. The studio decided, especially for the principals. But I do think this question about gender and the question about the gender in fighting, because I think gender in West Side Story is very complicated because there's a lot of ways where there's what we might call same-sex intimacies happening a lot of ways where there's sort of real tender relationships between men. There's really strong intimacies among women. And then there's also the character of Anybody's who is in a 21st century register reads at least like a butch lesbian, but very possibly like a trans masculine character, like a character on the trans spectrum. So this question, one of the interesting things about Anybody's is she starts a tomboy, she becomes probably a lesbian, and then now there's productions who are, like the film is approaching her as the character, Anybody's as possibly not using a she, her pronoun, possibly, and is hired a non-binary, gender non-conforming actor to play the role. And so there's ways in which, and that goes into the question of physicality and the physicality of violence and the physicality of fighting, because one of the ways that we see the Jet girls sort of do their battle, it's verbally and it's sort of sideways, but there's not a lot of fighting done by the women. And so there's something about the gender crossings that happen with Anybody's, which always is a very interesting story about the piece, especially given that one of the great unwritten songs of the show was to have been Maria's aria. There was always an expectation that the final sequence of the show, when Maria picked up the gun, that it would be a huge 11 o'clock number, a soaring soprano song of rage and grief and defiance and survival. In that great tradition, both operatic and musical, of a woman taking the stage and singing her face off about all the feelings that are yet to be said. But in the hustle, and Bernstein being overcommitted and nobody really knowing what she would say at that moment, and unlike the dummy lyric for A Boy Like That, which ended up being adapted into a full song, but the shortest song in the show, there was no dummy lyric for Maria's aria. And so ultimately, it ends up creating one of the most compelling pieces of both the film and the musical. It's a great musical that ends in musical silence. It doesn't end with a song. It ends with a feeling of loss, of rage, of grief, and ultimately dirge-like exit from the stage. And so there's something that is sort of enduringly resonant about that. And one of my favorite things as a West Side Story super geek is watching how productions stage that final exit, because that's where we see the politics of each musical, of each staging happen. Because in the final scene of the film, and I'll just finish out with this, is there's a moment when we see sort of the moment when his body is, and the gangs come together to be respectful of the body. There's a moment when Baby John puts a piece of fabric over Maria's head in sort of a grief posture. There's a moment when we see the young people coming together, the older folks standing useless. And the final image of the scene is Chino being walked away in handcuffs. So the final scene of the film is a depiction of Latino youth criminality, depicting of a young Latino man entering into the prison judiciary complex, right? That's not how it's scripted for the stage, and different productions take different stances in terms of like the stage direction that Arthur Lawrence offers at the end of the musical is the adults, and he lists them all, Gladhand, Doc, Schrank, and Krupke, stand around uselessly as the young people take care of their own grief. The film makes the very specific decision to depict the survival of law and order and of identifying the one person culpable for the violence that we have seen. And so it's a different narrative. And in some ways, that's one of the threads about when we see these different iterations of West Side Story, there are ways, as much as it's overlain by the powerful impact of both the stage and the film version, there are ways in which we can see these slight adjustments, whether it's I Feel Pretty or the final gesture, or in some ways the measures to which the production reaches out to be, quote, authentic or culturally responsible in the casting of the Puerto Rican characters. But there's one there, and so it remains a really compelling text. And also with that note of the concluding gesture of criminality and of the ways in which young Latino men are understood to be always in tension with the law, is actually a perfect setup for, if you want to come back in 3 weeks, I hope you will, to see a film that you may not have heard about before or may not have seen before, which is the film Zoot Suit, which is an extraordinary film, which is not so much a musical as a play with music, but is a piece that really does reckon with both the legacy of West Side Story, but then also the legacy of the narrative, of the kind of stereotypes and the kind of overdetermined narratives. And it's a really fascinating, additionally, a fascinating stage to screen adaptation. So I hope you'll seek it out. It's available on most platforms. And even though it's not one that you may have heard of or may have seen before, I think it will be something that you will be really glad to have the experience of if you choose to undertake it as you join us again at the end of this month. We're here every 3 Tuesdays. At the end on, I think it's October 27th, we'll be talking about Zoot Suit. And then 3 weeks after that, we'll be talking about Selena, which will be a good time. So I hope to see you back. And so once again, thanks for coming out tonight, and thanks for being here, and thanks for listening to me geek out about something I can always talk for an hour about. So you can, if you ask me about West Side Story, I'll probably be talking for an hour. So thanks for giving me a formal structure to allow that to happen. So, okay, great. So hopefully to see you, tell your friends, bring more people in. If your friends are members, they come free. Otherwise, there's a way to get in. And so, and this supports the Renew Theater, like whatever is your beloved Renew Theater, this supports its survival through this extraordinary time. So by buying that pass, or by buying that pass for somebody else, you are supporting some of the most important cinemas in our community. So thanks for joining us tonight. See you next time.